So in today's lesson, we will pick up with chapter 10, which is where we have left off. We've talked about in the previous module things like the American Revolution. We've discussed the Constitution, the Great Compromise, some of the compromises that were made, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Articles of Confederation, and how they were not really big enough, not really expansive enough to address the new Union. And so we talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists who came together and really kind of needed to decide how they could govern this new country in a way that not only recognized that some states had a larger population, some states had a more urban population, more urban industry, but also in a way that protected the rights of the small farmer and those in rural areas, particularly those moving into the western part of the country. Now, that last part is going to be very important as we move through today's section where we talk about the expansion of slavery into the western part of the country. Now, you probably recall, because there were several questions on your exam, about different states in the eastern part of the country that either allowed for gradual emancipation, like Pennsylvania, or immediately ended slavery, like Vermont in 1777. Some states like New Jersey did allow women and free blacks with property to vote. And then the Massachusetts State Supreme Court ruled that slavery was inconsistent with their constitution. Now, they didn't make slavery illegal. They just said that it's not really consistent with our constitution. And part of that, again, is the desire to protect the property rights of individuals. Now, as we move into this new territory, if you recall, the agreement was that the entire West would be a free territory. However, if a person had slaves, then their property rights would be protected. Now, this is in the territory. So as these territories come into the United States and seek statehood, then they will need to decide how they are going to govern themselves and what laws they will have and what property rights individuals will have. And so those things are very important as we're moving into the next section. You probably also recall that one of the things that Andrew Jackson advocated for was universal white male suffrage. So this meant that all white men, regardless of whether or not they owned property, so regardless of whether or not they were wealthy, would be able to vote. Now, this is incredibly important for two reasons. One thing that's accomplished here or achieved here is that the property requirement for voting is removed. However, another thing that takes place, another consequence, is that in the rare cases, the rare areas where white women or free blacks with property could vote, they'll lose that right. So those things are important as we move into the next section. Now, you have access to the PowerPoint, so I hope you'll follow along. You can always pause and go back if you need to. So we see a lot of territorial expansion and growth from profit. This profit's specifically connected to cotton, rice, and sugar cultivation, which increased what we call conspicuous consumption. Now, what I mean by that is that Southern planters are becoming very, very wealthy. And as they are becoming very, very wealthy, they are buying a lot of stuff. And some of that stuff they might need, but a lot of that stuff is really connected to the desire to sort of show off their wealth. And we see this boom really take place right after the 1830s. Now, the Planter Society, and when we talk about the Planter Society, what we mean is the wealthiest people, those who own large plantations. The Planter Society depends on slave productivity, and planters rely on extremely harsh methods of discipline to keep that productivity high. Now, remember, For the plantation owner, their ability to maintain their lifestyle, this conspicuous living, being able to travel, being able to buy lots of new things, the latest technologies, all of those things are really connected to their ability to maintain their income, which of course is connected to productivity. So they're going to need to keep that population of slaves working, and they're going to want to consistently increase their productivity. So what we see is some changes in women's roles, and the big one that we see is that the plantation mistress, the wife of the plantation master, the wife of the owner, her roles are going to change. Now, women have always worked on farms, they've always worked alongside their husbands, but the wealthiest women really were kind of isolated and protected from kind of the realities of work life. This will shift. And so the wife of the master, the wife of the plantation owner, she will sort of shift into this manager type role of the plantation. And so part of this will include the oversight of the slaves' living conditions. Now, this is very important because what this tells us is, again, not just the men, but the women also see the day-to-day lives of the slaves. They know how minimal the conditions are in terms of standard of living, and they really overlook that. So the benefits of slavery for the plantation mistress will really include a higher standard of living. It also means that their most strenuous domestic tasks they will no longer need to do. Now, recall that we live in a patriarchal system, which means that men really control all power. They control kind of movement in terms of commerce. They control movement in terms of people. They control the house. Because of this patriarchal system, women don't really have any rights, and we've talked about this in class. Women don't have the ability to say, that their husband is abusive or that their husband is abusive to the small children, and they don't have any protections really if they seek divorce. In some cases, when the wealthiest women could prove abuse or infidelity, they might be granted a divorce and they might be granted a small subsistence, so a small amount of money to sort of maintain their lives. However, and importantly, they would not retain the ability to keep their children with them. And so for many women, they stayed in these relationships and these situations because that was the only way that they felt they could actually protect their children. Additionally and importantly, the patriarchal system protected the husbands who engaged in sexual relationships, which is really to say husbands who engaged in rape with female slaves. For a female slave to resist would have meant, at minimum, a physical beating. It might include being separated from children that she already had, and it could even result in death. And so we're really talking about sexual assault, not really a sexual relationship. But for wives, they really didn't have the ability to say, this is not okay, or to speak out and advocate for slave wives. The wealthiest planters owned more than 50 slaves, but they did not constitute the majority of slaveholders. So I want to make sure that everyone really, really understands that. Make sure we write that down. The wealthiest people own more than 50 slaves, but they are not the majority. Most estimates indicate that about 3% of Southern slaveholders had more than 50 slaves. Now, these numbers are going to be very important as we move through the rest of the chapter, so we want to make sure we get those down. Again, about 3% owned 50 or more slaves. There were far more slaveholders who owned 3 to 6 slaves, usually not more than 10, and that's about 17% of the population. So again, please make sure we write those down. About 17% own less than 10 slaves. This is just in the South. but the majority of those 17% own 3 to 6 slaves. Okay, now do keep in mind, and we have talked about this, that slavery does still exist in those northern areas. Okay, we're not getting those statistics just yet. But who do you think held the most power in Southern society and Southern politics? Do you think it would be the majority of people, perhaps as many as 80% of people who do not own slaves? Do you think it would be the 17% of people who own 3 to 6 slaves? Or do you think that it would be the 3% who own 50 or more slaves? Now, if you said the 3%, you would be correct because they are the wealthiest people, right? So they control industry, they control politics, and they control the economy. So moving on to urban life in the slave South. Slave owners did not invest in industry or technology, and few factories existed in the South, and those that did exist were not enough to alter the economy. So what that tells us is that the majority of people in the South rely on slave labor or are laborers themselves. So that 80% of white Southerners who do not own slaves are likely laborers themselves. So they might be working in plantations and they might be working on their own small farms. Southern urban development and Southerners' access to cash currency also lagged behind significantly in the North. So that means that Southerners don't really have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of cash. So in order to make purchases, they're going to need to be able to rely on barter or exchange, or a word bond. So an agreement that at some point in the future, I would have a certain amount of cotton or a certain amount of corn, a certain amount of rice, and I would be able to pay you for what you have done for me now. Now, I want to remind you, if the majority of the industry and the technology is not in the South, we know that it's in the North primarily because the West is still developing, which means that the demand for the cotton, for the corn, for rice, for other textile goods, those kinds of things, is really coming from the North and Europe. So again, this is an entire country that's really benefiting either directly or indirectly from slave labor. Some free blacks were drawn to southern cities because there were jobs there. However, white Southerners viewed these cities with great suspicion because they served as kind of an escape area for runaway slaves. Now, this is incredibly important because many of these slaves do try to run away. They go to urban areas. Hopefully, they're able to get on a ship and leave the country or move into a northern area where slavery may or may not be legal, but in either case will still be protected. Planters depend on river systems, and this helps them to move those goods. Last week we talked about Robert Fulton and the steamboat. And so what that does is that really increases the ability to move products through rivers instead of having to put them on large ships. And so this makes it much easier to move cotton, other agricultural products from the south into the north, and increases the ability to move goods from the north into the south. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is planters expand the slave system, the consequences of slavery's expansion. So we see a lot of technological advances in agriculture that were not implemented in the South. And so planters will continue to rely on the manual labor primarily of slaves. By 1850, slave owners in the South were outnumbered by non-slaveholding whites, and most slaves lived on large plantations. If you recall, in chapter 6, I believe, or chapter 7, we mentioned that South Carolina's population of slaves was more than double the free population by about 1760. And so, again, we're seeing massive, massive numbers of slaves either being brought into the country, but most importantly, increasing by natural reproduction. The end of the international slave trade in 1808, make sure you have that date down, this is 1808. We see the end of the international slave trade. This, combined with the increased desire for productivity, combined to make slaves more valuable. Slave owners were forced to treat their slaves better to ensure that they were physically able to perform the work. Now, I want to stress that just because they were treated marginally better does not mean that slaves really enjoy any freedom. Because they are still bonded, they are still bound to the plantation. There were limits to the treatment of slaves, and we see this in the slaves' diet and health care and their living conditions in general. Diets were minimal, so not really any meats or proteins, some beans, corn, rice, things that you might see fed also to livestock. Healthcare, extremely minimal in terms of, wounds really not being treated, um, losing appendages, things like that, not really being treated either. Broken bones, those sorts of things, not being treated. Um, and then importantly, living conditions were extremely, extremely dilapidated. So we're talking about, um, very, very ramshackle type buildings, no real ability to keep heat in, dirt floors, which are especially troublesome in a rainy season when you don't have a very good roof, an ability to keep the rain out. Um, Minimal ability to stay warm in the wintertime, minimal blankets, minimal clothing, those sorts of things. But westward expansion impacted whites and blacks, and both endured harsher conditions than they were used to. For black slaves, moving west included the additional burden of being torn from their families. So as the West is expanding and as the nation is growing, and recall with the Louisiana Purchase, the size of the nation doubles effectively overnight. Many people, for a variety of reasons, try to go west. For some, it's the adventure. For some, it's the prospect of land. For some runaway slaves, it's the hope of potential freedom. But also black slaves are being brought into the western area as well. And so in addition to that separation from their family, they're going to need to navigate a new terrain, a new climate, new land, new work experiences. So the expansion of slavery that we're seeing means that we'll see an increase in what we call the slave market. So we'll see more slaves being purchased, being sold, and being traded across the nation at this particular time. So again, this is post-revolution, post-constitution, so those things are important to consider. It's also important to take a moment to remind you that, again, this is something that the entire country is involved in, either directly or indirectly. So I want to point you to this spread of slavery and cotton. And so what I want you to pay attention to, and we can see, Virginia down into Georgia and places like that. These are kind of the deep South areas. This is 1820, so this is before the Andrew Jackson presidency. And this is 1860, just before the beginning of the Civil War. So what we see is that for every dot, we have about 200 slaves. Now remember, the largest plantations are going to have more than 50, but the majority of slaveholders are going to have 3 to 6, but no more than 10 slaves. Um, so in the course of about 30 years, you can see that these numbers quadruple. Richmond, Charleston, Augusta, places like this, over here in Baton Rouge, where we see intense populations in 1820, those numbers will continue to increase, but we'll see increases in places like Kentucky here into the Missouri Territory, Arkansas, Mississippi, and on over into Texas. At the same time that we're seeing this increase in population, it's important to understand that the increase in slave population is connected to the increase in the amount of cotton being produced or other products like corn, tobacco, rice, indigo, those types of products. So in 1820, these areas here, South Carolina, Georgia, down here in Baton Rouge, make a mental note here of those river areas, right? Because those are going to be important as well. We see, again, as we move closer to 1860, the number of cotton bales being produced increases by at least 3 to 4 times, right? So there's a direct correlation between the increase in slavery and the increase in production, right? And again, this is connected to what? What's the key word there? The key word, it's connected to wealth and power. So moving on to slave society and slave culture, we'll talk briefly about what life is like for the slaves. So the North and the South became dependent on slave labor. And I know that I have said that so many times in class, but I think that's really important to understand, because sometimes we focus on the fact that we have large plantations in the South, and we know that slavery exists in the South, and we know that that's really the primary cause of the Civil War. But what we forget, what we don't always see in movies and in Hollywood, is that the North is really benefiting from slavery. They're depending on slave labor, because without slave labor, right, without the cotton production, we can't run those factories and those mills in the North that give jobs to immigrant groups, right? That give jobs to women who need to support their families. Without slave labor, we can't sell those products, right, that have been turned out in those mills to Europe and back to the South. Skilled slaves added to the economy, but their relative independence, even as limited as it was, made them very, very suspect to white people. So when we talk about skilled slaves, what we're talking about is slaves that have learned to kind of work alongside an apprentice, right? So we're talking about urban slaves who might work in dock areas and on ships. We're talking about urban slaves who may work in a factory, because that's where they've sort of been purchased to. Domestic slaves lead physically demanding lives, and they hold a lot of jobs within the household. So we talk about domestic slaves, we're talking about people who work in the household, cooking, cleaning, child rearing, those kinds of things. These are important. This is important to note because their experiences are different. They do have a lot more oversight than slaves who work in the fields, but they have a more comfortable life in terms of a less sort of artist labor type job. Oh, back up, back up. Okay. We also see field hands who lead very, very physically demanding jobs. They labor outside. However, they have a benefit in not having a lot of immediate white oversight. And so what this means is that they're able to form new bonds. So this is where we see spirituals. This is where we see stories and family histories passed on. This is where we see culture passed down. This is where we see kind of slave medicine shared, those sorts of things that are able to be shared and passed and exchanged simply because there's very minimal oversight. Field laborers worked either by task or by a gang system. So the task system allows slaves some free times once they have completed their task. So in this case, the slave may need to go out and do a certain amount of labor. And so if a certain row or a certain field is picked, then the slaves are free for the day. And so that freedom, again, is connected to how quickly they perform the labor. Um, or they may work in a gang system where groups of slaves are taken out, primarily young men that might be sort of apt to run away. And they have an immediate overseer, and they're expected to work, from sunup until sundown. Okay, so I mentioned that we see language, religion, healthcare, a lot of those things being passed down. This is really, again, connected to some of that minimal oversight that some slaves are able to experience. But slaves develop what we call a syncretic culture, which is a blend of African and North American culture. And this is very, very important because what it illustrates is resilience among slaves, but also the ability to adapt and survive. This helps slaves to maintain their African roots and build social bonds. African Americans applied this blending of culture to worship as well. We see some adaptation of Christianity as well as tribal religions. Female slaves adopted various aspects of Christianity as a means of protection. This is very, very important. Remember that Great Awakening where we had those interracial and intercultural church services, and it scared people because their fear was that if the masses, right, if the poorest populations begin to focus on the things that united them rather than the things that divided them, that they would overthrow the power structure in place. And so Christianity continues, and it's something that is used by slave owners to hopefully subjugate the slave. And so they would preach sermons that said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we should accept the condition that we're in, that this is where God has placed us. And so in order to be a good Christian, that we accept where we are and we embrace that and we don't resist that. And so the hope was, of course, that slaves would not try to run away and that they would kind of accept this bondage. For female slaves, what they saw was what was hopefully an attempt to protect their children by baptizing them, by asking that slave owners bless a marriage, that ministers would sort of sanctify a marriage between slaves. The hope was that they would become more humanized to the plantation owner. Um, they did not, right? So we'll talk about this in the coming weeks, but eventually it will become illegal to share Christianity and the Bible with slaves because slaves will start to say, if God made us all, right, and God loves us all, then why are some people slaves and some people not slaves? And so, this impact of religion, this adaptation of religion, is extremely important. Slaves also used natural medicines to provide health care within their communities. Some of this medicine being tribal, and then some of this medicine being things that have been learned since slaves have come to the New World as early as the 1600s. We do have important forms of resistance and rebellion that begin to take place as well. And so I want to make sure that we understand sort of the difference between resistance and rebellion. So resistance being a little less forceful, and then rebellion being much, much more forceful. So slaves employed what we call subtle and overt resistance. And so some of those subtle forms of resistance might be to work slow, right? So we just decrease our productivity. They might break tools. They might destroy crops, and then they might damage household goods. Okay, so these are kind of subtle forms of resistance, things that might not necessarily be evident to the plantation owner's eye. More overt resistance would be to run away. To run away from the plantation and to try to escape. So two different types of resistance there. And then we also have outright rebellion. So I want to mention the Nat Turner Rebellion, which takes place in 1831. So Nat Turner was a slave, but he was also a self-styled preacher. So he considered himself a Christian. He understood biblical teachings, and he was also a preacher. So he had a congregation of other African slaves. He organized a rebellion in which he and his followers liberated more than 50 slaves and killed 57 whites. Now, this is significant, right? Because this is forceful rebellion, but this is also violent rebellion, right? Because we have people who are murdered. Nat Turner and 55 other blacks who were a part of this rebellion were eventually executed. White mobs also attacked more than 200 African Americans who had no connection to the uprising. So we see a violent uprising, a forceful pushback to slavery from Nat Turner, and then that is of course very quickly quashed. But it's also quashed with much, much, much force. 200 African Americans are attacked, and there's no connection whatsoever to this uprising. But an important thing takes place here. Nat Turner's rebellion instills fear in the white slave owners, right? Because until this uprising, most white slave owners just believed that slaves would continue to accept this condition. And so this uprising really illustrates that slaves are tired of being bonded and that they're willing to fight and die for their freedom. This also inspires a lot of anxiety among slaves, right? Because now they're very, very concerned about how they're going to be perceived and treated on their plantations, right? Um, Plantation life will significantly change after this 1831 rebellion. New laws will go into place to restrict the movement of free blacks. Additional overseers will be added to large plantations to listen to conversations among slaves. Many slaves saw the rebels' executions as real evidence that white Southerners would go to any extreme to protect slavery. So they will go beyond physical abuse to murder, right? So they're willing to kill slaves to protect the institution of slavery. And then we're going to pause right here today. This gets us to the end of the Nat Turner section. If you have any questions, please let me know.